At exactly 11:58 p.m., under a bruised sky heavy with the promise of rain, a cloaked figure was seen gliding across the frost-bitten grounds of Ravenmoor Abbey, a ruin whispered about more often than visited. Moments later, as the wind howled through the chapel's collapsed rafters like a choir of restless spirits, she vanished, right before the eyes of a retired judge known for his unwavering reason. Within hours, rumors spread through the ivy-choked lanes of East Hallow like wildfire through brittle parchment. Welcome, dear listener, to another tale that crackles with unanswered questions and secrets time refused to bury, where the perceptive and ever-watchful Miss Marple finds herself drawn into a mystery woven from silence and shadow. Before we uncover what lies beyond the veil, we'd love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from? What time is it on your clock? Share your answers below. It brings our circle closer, and helps more wanderers find their way to these darkened crossroads. Now, take a breath, pour something warm, and listen closely. The judge, Sir Gideon Clay, had followed the figure after glimpsing her kneeling at the center of the ruined chapel, motionless, as if mourning something only she remembered. Her black veil swayed, though there was no breeze. When she disappeared, Sir Gideon staggered back in disbelief, the ancient iron gate creaking behind him as he fled. He returned not an hour later, breathless, with young Deputy Finch in tow, who still smelled of sleep and suspicion. But the chapel was deserted, untouched, undisturbed, as though the vision had been stitched from mist. The earth was unbroken, the ivy intact, and the altar cold. Even the constable's torch failed to reveal any sign of life. A dream, perhaps, the deputy muttered. But Gideon knew better. East Hallow was already stirring, dusting off old tales of wartime betrayals, and the Abbey's final cursed midnight mass. At the tea room the next morning, chatter spilled like cream over scones. Some claimed the figure was the abbess who vanished with a royal secret. Others, a long-dead bride still searching for her vows. Miss Marple, present but quiet, merely sipped her tea, eyes distant, heart already tangled in the first threads of truth. She sat motionless near the hearth, the flicker of the fire casting shifting shadows across her face, her gaze fixed on the warped mirror above the mantel, where her reflection seemed to waver unnaturally, as if something else stared back. In Thornwick Hollow, where the fog curled thick as cream and the air reeked of secrets long buried, silence was seldom innocent. The villagers had always whispered of the Gravenhurst Asylum ruins, but when the local miller's daughter vanished one frost-bitten morning, her boots found neatly placed at the chapel gate, the whispers grew teeth. It wasn't the girl's disappearance that unnerved Dr. Elspeth Rowan. It was the single white feather, blood-speckled and tucked between the chapel door hinges, a gesture too precise for nature and too personal for chance. And when the new caretaker arrived, cloaked in a physician's coat far too elegant for rural work, claiming no surname, and carrying nothing but an old satchel of surgical tools and a box of music sheets, the town held its breath. He rarely spoke, yet each evening, candlelight flickered behind the asylum's boarded windows, and mournful violin notes drifted through the mist like a sorrowful confession. Children claimed to see a girl in white pacing along the tree line, her lips moving in soundless speech. Bread vanished from doorsteps, cats refused to pass the chapel wall, and 3 separate villagers fell ill after hearing the violin's tune in their dreams. Rowan, known for her clinical calm, now found herself watching the feather over her fireplace tremble without breeze, and wondered, not for the first time, whether grief had a shape, or whether it sometimes returned, veiled in flesh, to finish what the past had left undone. By the time dusk draped its grey veil over Ashwood Parish, the stranger had already become a story. She had arrived unannounced 3 days prior, just as the storm broke, stepping off the 6:12 from Norcombe, with nothing but a threadbare carpet-bag, and an air of deliberate invisibility. Dressed in outdated morning clothes, black bombazine high collar, no hat, she made her way to the weather-worn gardener's shed behind the old rectory, where light had not shone for nearly 7 winters. No one had given her permission, yet the key lost for years had somehow unlocked the door. By morning the hearth was alight, and pale smoke curled from the chimney like breath from an old secret. No one had seen her come or go, and yet by Thursday, several swore she had passed them on the lane, head bowed, lips moving faintly in some forgotten tongue. She gave no name, signed nothing, spoke only once to the milk boy, asking if the chapel bell still rang at vespers, her voice a brittle murmur, as if unused to being heard. But it was the following night, during candle-lit evensong, when the fracture first showed. The choir had just begun nearer, "My God to thee," when the stranger, seated at the very back, jolted, as if struck, then folded inward, like a figure recoiling from some private agony. Her gloved hand rose to her chest, eyes fixed on the altar, wide with a recognition that chilled Miss Templeton 2 pews away. She told Mrs. Whitby the look was not of grief, but of guilt, raw and unrepentant. By Friday morning, the village was rife with questions. How had she entered the locked grounds? Who had permitted her to stay? And why, most pressing of all, did she leave no footprints along the frosted path, though the ground had been soft and freshly rained? And still she remained, wordless, watchful, and utterly unclaimed. It was on a rain-swept Monday morning that the first unease slipped like a shadow into the parish of Elmbrook, unseen by most, but not by Miss Edna Bramley, whose days began precisely at 6 with a polished silver kettle, and an ear for the unusual. The woman in grey arrived not with the dawn, but just after it, walking the narrow lane that led to the disused bell tower of St. Jude Set, its bells long silenced by lightning decades prior. She carried no luggage, wore no expression, and yet within 2 days had taken residence in the tower keeper's cottage, a place sealed since the passing of Jonathan Pike, whose tragic end, fallen from the very top rung during an unseasonal storm, had never sat quite right with those who remembered. Miss Bramley, no gossip but no fool either, observed the woman's peculiar habits. She lit a lantern at dusk and extinguished it at dawn, accepted no callers, and once during evensong, could be seen standing beneath the crumbling arch, lips moving in prayer, not known to the Book of Common Worship. But it was the third day that chilled Miss Bramley to the bone, when the wind carried down the hill a sound that hadn't been heard in nearly 30 years, the low groan of the great bell, long rusted into silence. That night, a church record book vanished from the vicar's locked drawer, and with it, the page bearing the names of those buried during the year 1904, a year marked by an unspoken scandal, and the quiet drowning of 3 orphaned siblings, their graves left unmarked at the behest of a now-dead benefactor. When questioned, the woman gave a name that matched no registry, and a stare that lingered just too long. Miss Bramley, whose memory was sharper than her knitting needles, recalled then an old story told only once of a girl named Eliza Moorcroft, accused of theft and blasphemy, who vanished from the bell tower the night before her judgment, leaving behind only a hair ribbon and the faintest scent of lavender. The woman in grey wore lavender, and on the 7th day, she too vanished, but not before the bell rang once more, louder this time, mournful, final, echoing down into a village that once again would not speak of what it feared might return. They said the monastery on the cliffs had been empty for over 60 years, abandoned after the fire that claimed 3 lives, and left its name whispered with unease. But last Tuesday, just as the fog rolled inland from the sea, a woman arrived on foot, dressed in charcoal grey with a satchel, and no name. She asked for a room at the Widow Lane Inn, and signed the guest book with a looping script that read, Eleanor Gray. Father Levens, the retired priest who once tended the chapel's altar, had not spoken in public for years, but when he saw her from his window that evening, his hand trembled so violently, he spilled the sacramental wine. Across the village, whispers started. She bore an uncanny resemblance to Sister Myriel, the youngest nun lost in the blaze, but Sister Myriel had perished, hadn't she? That night, in the thick hush past midnight, Eleanor was seen walking barefoot along the path to the ruins, carrying nothing but a lantern, and an old book bound in crimson leather. By morning the old bell in the tower, long rusted into silence, was ringing. Miss Adele Cray, a local historian, and the only one with maps of the catacombs beneath the chapel, reported that her home had been ransacked, the maps taken. She found only a single item left on her writing desk, a feather scorched at the tip, like it had been dipped in flame. When Inspector Lennox, a skeptic by trade but a man of precise instinct, heard this, he visited the ruins. There among the blackened stones, he found fresh footprints, narrow, unshod, and a symbol carved recently into the altar, a 7-pointed star with a single eye at the center. That night, as the wind howled through the narrow lanes of the village, he too received a note, slipped beneath his door, the handwriting elegant and unnervingly familiar. She brings with her what was never meant to return. The fire did not end it. Watch the crypts. Midnight. And so, with the weight of unease pressing against his ribs, Lennox descended the overgrown stairwell behind the chapel just before 12. Lantern raised, footsteps cautious, he moved deeper into the cold earth. And then, just as his breath began to cloud from the chill, he heard it, not footsteps, not whispers, but music. A violin, playing something fractured and sorrowful, echoing from the stone corridors. At that moment, Lennox knew with chilling certainty, the past hadn't been buried, it had been waiting. It was just after midnight, when the village clock struck once, muffled by the thickening fog that crept through Ashbridge Hollow like a phantom returned. Behind the abandoned chapel, half swallowed by ivy and silence, a pale figure emerged from the shadows, barefoot, breath visible in the cold, and eyes wide with a fear not of man, but memory. She moved swiftly, as if fleeing something unseen, clutching an old lantern and a bundle wrapped in cloth. By dawn, the groundskeeper found the chapel's oak door ajar, its hinges weeping rust. Inside, beneath the shattered stained glass window of St. Agnes, lay the body of a young woman draped in a black travel cloak, her hands pressed to her chest, as if in prayer, but her lips were blue, and a single trickle of blood had traced a path from the corner of her mouth to her chin. Near her feet, a foreign coin lay half buried in candle wax, marked with a sigil no one could identify. Constable Rowan, summoned from his morning rounds, found no sign of struggle, but he did find an envelope, wedged between the pews, addressed in a trembling hand to return what was promised. Miss Evelyn Hart, the village's quietest widow, and a former codebreaker in the war, examined the handwriting, frowning. "This isn't suicide," she whispered, more to herself than the room. "It's a warning, one written too late." As rumors began to swirl, of betrayal during the Blitz, of a hidden cache buried beneath the church, of an oath sealed with death, the village, so often silent, began to remember things it had long tried to forget. And when the second body was found, slumped in the bell tower, with a broken watch clutched in one hand, and a map torn in half in the other, it became clear this was no ghost story. This was unfinished business, and someone among them was ready to kill to keep the past buried. The morning after the rainstorm, the village of Elmsworth awoke not to birdsong, but to whispers, thick as fog and twice as chilling. At the edge of the graveyard behind St. Thomas Chapel, a trail of disturbed earth led to a half-exposed iron locket, nestled like a forgotten relic in the roots of a yew tree older than memory. It was the milkman who saw it first, and by noon the vicarage was flooded with murmurs of curses, soldiers and sins buried during war. No one remembered the name Annalise Faulkner, yet by dusk it was on every tongue. She'd arrived 2 weeks prior, thin, silent, wrapped in mourning black, with no luggage but a violin case, and a letter addressed to the one who knows. She had kept to herself, save for nightly walks toward the chapel ruins, always returning just before the bell tolled midnight. When her body was discovered crumpled beside the altar, one hand clutching a singed page from an old parish ledger, and the other stiff around a faded photograph of a boy in uniform, the village's gossip turned to dread. There were no signs of a struggle, yet the bruising along her collarbone, and the faint print of fingertips on her neck whispered otherwise. Inspector Elwood, summoned from the district capital, dismissed the scene as suicide, but Miss Eleanor Brine, the retired historian and part-time organist, noted something others missed. The soil beneath Annalise's knees was wet, but the hem of her dress remained clean, suggesting she had knelt after death, or hadn't knelt at all. And there was the matter of the ledger. The page she held had been torn, yet the ink bled fresh, and the names listed bore no parish record anywhere in the archives. One, however, had been etched into the wall of the confessional centuries ago. Elias Whitcomb, presumed dead in 1944, listed as a deserter, and rumored to have fled with secrets meant never to see daylight. Miss Eleanor, recalling a letter her grandmother once received in trembling script and sealed with foreign wax, believed Annalise hadn't come to deceive but to deliver. Deliver what, or to whom, remained cloaked in shadow. And as the villagers returned to their lives, locking doors with unease and glancing twice at strangers, no one noticed the silhouette that lingered too long by the chapel gate each night, or that the violin still propped beside the fireplace in the vicar's study sometimes played a single note just before dawn. In the quiet village of Marlowe's Hollow, where days passed in the comforting rhythm of kettle whistles and clipped hedges, the ordinary turned sinister one frost-bitten Tuesday morning. It was Mrs. Pritchard, while dusting the brass candlesticks in St. Alban's Chapel, who noticed it first, not the candlesticks, but the faintest indentation in the kneeling cushion within the left confessional booth, oddly paired with a fine layer of dust clinging stubbornly to the lower hinge. Every other hinge had clearly been wiped recently, but that one, barely perceptible, like shadow on velvet, remained untouched save for a smudged crescent where fingers had gripped with intention. Such a detail might have escaped anyone else's notice, but not Margaret Copley, the retired schoolteacher, who had a habit of watching rather than speaking. She had once said people revealed more in silence than they ever did in words. Margaret quietly deduced that someone had used the booth not for confession, but for concealment, perhaps listening in, waiting. The dust, uneven and disturbed only where the hinge met wood, told a deliberate story. Someone had opened it from the inside, slowly, intentionally, and had known exactly when to act. By evening, the village, never one to shy away from drama, had whipped itself into a frenzy of speculation. Whispers circled faster than the wind through the churchyard. Was the stranger, a woman calling herself Eleanor Drake, who had rented the old Wexley cottage, truly a bereaved niece, or had she come for something long buried beneath the chapel stones? There were tales now, resurrected over tea and biscuits, of a nun who vanished in the 1940s, rumored to have fled with a child, and secrets worth killing for. Some said Eleanor wasn't impersonating her at all, but was her returned after decades with a new name, and a face the years had only slightly weathered. Margaret said nothing publicly, but at night, she reread an old diary she had kept in 1961, which spoke of a fire, a missing relic, and a priest who resigned suddenly, leaving behind a sealed envelope, marked not to be opened until the bells stopped ringing. No one knew what that meant. Not yet, but the bells, ancient, rusted and unreliable, had stopped 2 days before the woman arrived. The village of Ashford's Hollow had decided, almost unanimously, that Claire Mallory, the woman in the convent shadows, was nothing more than a figment of unspoken rumors, perhaps a singer with a tragic past, or a scheming outsider. But in their eagerness to dismiss her, they also chose to ignore a far darker, more complicated truth that was lingering beneath the surface. It wasn't until Miss Marple, in her quiet and unassuming way, sought access to a room that had long been overlooked, the small back room of the church, which had once served as a sanctuary for the convent's guests, that the first real clue emerged. There, buried under piles of forgotten documents and tarnished frames, Miss Marple discovered the thing that had been concealed for decades, a portrait of a group of nuns. It was old, stained with time, and had clearly been left in neglect. The image depicted a gathering of women, framed for a donor's commemoration. But as she peered closer, Miss Marple's keen eyes caught a startling detail. The plaque that should have been affixed at the bottom of the frame was gone. Its place now only held the twisted remnants of screws, leaving a rectangular patch of bright wood, untouched by time. Someone had carefully removed that plaque, an act not of theft, but of erasure. It had been taken, deliberately, and with precision, to obscure the past. For a moment, Miss Marple stood frozen, the weight of the discovery settling over her. Whoever had taken the plaque had wanted Agnes to be forgotten, her name erased from history as if it had never existed. The mystery was no longer just about Claire Mallory's identity. It was now clear that the true question was who Sister Agnes had threatened to become. What secrets did she know, and who would go to such lengths to bury her memory? As Miss Marple pondered these revelations, she realized there was more to be uncovered in the church's financial records. With a polite but determined request, she asked to see the parish records from the war years. Mildly curious, Miss Cynthia, ever obliging, fetched the dusty, well-kept books from the locked drawer beneath the vicar's desk. The ledgers meticulously recorded, detailed donations, repairs and charity distributions. But when Miss Marple turned to the pages for April 1940 to June 1941, her fingers paused, tracing the neat, clean edges of 2 missing pages. The gap was unnerving. It wasn't a careless slip or an accidental loss. It was deliberate, surgical. Someone had torn those pages out, leaving behind perfect, unbroken stubs of the remaining entries. The absence was far more disturbing than the presence of the pages. They had been taken, not lost, removed to conceal something that had been hidden for far too long. It wasn't just the disappearance of financial records that bothered Miss Marple. It was the undeniable knowledge that someone had gone to great lengths, long before Claire Mallory ever set foot in Nether Hatchington, to ensure those particular pages were erased. The meticulous removal of such crucial information hinted at a deliberate attempt to suppress something far more significant than mere transactions. Miss Marple slowly closed the book, her fingers brushing the cover as though to seal away the disquiet it had stirred within her. What had been lost wasn't just a record of financial dealings. It had been a testament to the past. Names, favors, perhaps even the shadows of betrayals. Each name removed from history like a carefully discarded ghost. Whoever had sought to erase it had succeeded, and Miss Marple had no doubt that Sister Agnes had been at the heart of it. Wherever she had gone, someone had followed her, and whatever secrets she carried, they had not been meant to stay hidden for long. But there was one detail Miss Marple could not ignore: Edwin Aldrich. Few in Nether Hatchington could have forgotten him, though his memory had faded into the quiet corners of the village's collective history. Edwin, the younger brother of the vicar, had always been a man of books and quiet contemplation. He had joined a government bureau during the war, an agency so secretive that it might as well have never existed. His death, reported in 1941 as a casualty of a bombing raid, had been met with a somber finality, and like so many other war losses, it had been swiftly relegated to the past. Yet whispers had begun to surface back then, whispers of his strange absences, his peculiar habits, and an unsettling attachment to the convent at St. Winters. It was said in hushed tones that he visited the chapel often, though not for spiritual reasons. His conversations, when he was seen, weren't with the vicar or the Mother Superior, but with one of the novices, Sister Agnes herself. Miss Marple's memory stirred with a vivid image of Edwin Aldrich, standing at the back of the church, his gaze not on the altar, but on the side aisle, the very place where the novices entered in procession. She could still recall the look on his face, wistful, as if he were searching for something he had lost long ago. A man who had suffered a double loss, one that had left an indelible mark on his soul. And now, decades later, someone else had returned to the village, carrying the same sorrow that Edwin had once worn so heavily. The vicarage had kept Edwin's room preserved, much as Miss Cynthia had noted. It was more a matter of sentiment than practical need. Yet it brought her comfort, as if holding on to the past might ease the grief of the present. The shelves still held his books, arranged in the way he had left them, and the wardrobe still contained his coat, the buttons dulled by the passage of time, a silent tribute to his absence. It was in this room that Miss Marple, with polite determination and a quiet resolve, began her search. She had been granted permission to explore, and she intended to leave no stone unturned, for in this room, she sensed, lay more than just the remnants of a life. There was something still hidden, something tied to Edwin Aldridge's mysterious connections to Sister Agnes, and perhaps to the dark history of the village itself. Miss Marple moved with deliberate care, each step calculated and thoughtful, her gaze scanning every inch of the room as though she were piecing together a puzzle. This was not the work of someone driven by morbid curiosity, nor was it the careless rummaging of an amateur. It was the quiet, methodical investigation of a woman who had spent years understanding the language of forgotten things, those small overlooked fragments of lives that people unwittingly leave behind. Among the religious books, a small volume of Psalms caught her attention. Its leather cover was worn, the spine split ever so slightly from years of use, but it was the faint texture of something hidden beneath the surface that piqued her interest. With a practiced touch, Miss Marple traced the edge of the spine, feeling something foreign tucked within the lining. It was subtle but deliberate, a piece of history carefully concealed. When she gently pried open the split spine, Miss Marple discovered the object within, a locket, neatly wrapped in a linen handkerchief, protected with care against the ravages of time. She unfolded the cloth with the reverence of someone handling a relic of the past, and held the locket in her palm. It was delicate silver, its clasp worn nearly smooth from use. This was no mere trinket. It was something much more personal, more intimate. A sentimental object. Yes, but not given out of love. It had been kept hidden away with purpose. The realization struck Miss Marple like a flash of insight. With the quiet certainty that only years of experience could bring, she understood. Edwin Aldridge had loved someone deeply, passionately, but never openly. Not from afar, not in secret admiration, but with a restrained intensity that he had never dared to voice. This locket, carefully preserved and concealed, was not just a token of affection. It was a memory locked away in time. A love that could not be spoken aloud, but was instead hidden in faith, in prayer, in the pages of Psalms. The locket held more than just sentimental value. Inside, tucked within its delicate silver frame, was a single photograph. Small, sepia-toned, its edges slightly curled with age. The face in the photograph was unmistakable. It was Claire Mallory, younger, less composed, her hair falling loosely about her shoulders in a way that contrasted sharply with the composed figure the village had come to know. The same woman, the same face, but this photograph revealed something new, a version of her that had been hidden away, locked in the past, just as the locket had been. Opposite the image, etched in elegant, looping script on the inner lid, was a French phrase, Pour toujours mon cœur, forever my heart. Miss Marple read the inscription again, turning the words over in her mind. This was no flirtatious sentiment, no passing affection. It was something far more profound, a declaration of a love that had endured through silence, through time, through distance. It was the language of someone who had belonged to another in a way that could not be expressed in words, but only in the quiet, hidden places of the heart. The locket was not just a gift, it was a vow, a promise. It had been kept, carefully preserved, not discarded, not forgotten. And in that preservation, Miss Marple saw the shape of an old, desperate compromise, one that had been forged in secrecy, in a time when the world was at war, and hearts were bound by more than just affection, but by necessity, duty, and the shadows of unspoken sacrifices. She understood now. Edwin had not lived long, but in that short time, he had carried a love too dangerous to speak aloud, and somewhere, buried in the past, that love had left its mark, a mark that even the years could not erase. Miss Marple knew this discovery would lead her closer to understanding the true nature of Claire Mallory's arrival in Nether Hatchington. The secrets that had been buried here were not only about the convent or the past, but about a love lost, concealed, and now perhaps, finally coming to light. It was a truth Claire Mallory had perhaps known all along, that her return to Nether Hatchington had come far too late for forgiveness. Miss Marple closed the locket with deliberate care, her fingers tracing its smooth silver surface one last time before she returned it to its linen shroud. Whatever history had been sealed within the delicate photograph, whatever emotions had been left unspoken between Claire and Edwin, were not meant for anyone else to discover. Yet, Despite their intent to remain hidden, someone, had gone to great lengths to prevent this memory from being uncovered. The locket was but one piece of a much larger, more intricate puzzle, one that Miss Marple could feel was slipping slowly into place. But her next visit would bring another revelation, one that would shed more light on the long-forgotten history of Edwin Aldrich. Miss Peabody, the village seamstress and keeper of many secrets, had not thought of Edwin in years. But when Miss Marple arrived under the guise of mending a lace collar, the old woman's memory stirred to life with surprising clarity. "Yes, he came to me, just before the raid started." Miss Peabody recalled, her needle working slowly but steadily. "He wanted something embroidered, a veil. Not a wedding veil, and not one for a play. It was a nun's veil, made of fine muslin, with a delicate lace border. Took me 3 evenings to finish." The seamstress's hands moved thoughtfully as she spoke, her mind clearly replaying the moment with vivid precision. It was to be a gift, Edwin had said, but he never mentioned for whom. The order had come with strict instructions. No receipt, no markings to indicate its purpose. Just fine, delicate work, the kind that was meant to be worn with reverence. Miss Marple listened intently, not interrupting, making no notes, but as the seamstress described the details. The shape of the lace, the cut longer than usual, almost ceremonial. Miss Marple's mind began to unravel a deeper truth. Edwin had not been planning a deception. No, this was something far more personal, far more poignant. He had planned a tribute, a gesture, perhaps even an escape. What Edwin had hoped to give, someone had worn years later, not as a memory, not as a relic of a forgotten past, but as a disguise. A disguise, Miss Marple knew, always hides more than just a face. It veils the soul beneath. But it was not the veil itself that would reveal the truth. No, it was how it had been worn. Miss Marple recalled the way Claire Mallory had worn her veil when she first arrived in the village. How she adjusted the fabric so carefully, her fingers moving with a practiced, almost instinctual grace along the hem. How she kept the fold taut at the nape of her neck. These were not gestures learned from a costume designer's manual. These were habits, ingrained through years of repetition. Gestures that spoke of a life lived in secrecy, of something far deeper than simple disguise. Claire had worn the veil not just to hide her identity, but to preserve something. Perhaps a promise, perhaps a sorrow. Miss Marple had observed Claire for weeks, watching the way she moved, how she behaved around the villagers. And now, with a new understanding of the veil's significance, she realized how much had been concealed in plain sight. Claire Mallory had come to Nether Hatchington with more than just a fabricated identity. She had come with the weight of a past that was never meant to resurface. And the closer Miss Marple came to the truth, the clearer it became. The secrets that Claire had buried deep within the folds of her life were not just about love lost or duty fulfilled. They were about a choice, a sacrifice, and an unspoken connection that had bound her to Edwin Aldrich in ways that neither of them had ever been willing to reveal. And as the pieces of this puzzle began to fall into place, Miss Marple knew that the time had come for the final chapter of this mystery to unfold. Claire Mallory had never been a nun, a fact that led Miss Marple to consider a far more unsettling possibility. That the veil she had worn, far from being fabricated for her, had been inherited, passed down, preserved, perhaps even cherished. It had not come from a wardrobe, or from some fleeting whim. No, this veil had been woven from the threads of memory itself. A memory, once wrapped in Edwin's quiet grief, had resurfaced, not as a gesture of reverence, but as something far more dangerous. Someone, somewhere, had recognized it. They had seen the veil, and understood its meaning, understood what it had once symbolized, and in doing so, they had feared its return. The veil was not the object of Claire's deception. It was a symbol, a remnant of something buried long ago, but now revived. And as it reappeared, it revived the forgotten story of Agnes, a tale long buried under layers of time and silence. The veil itself was not what condemned Claire, but rather the history it carried with it, the story it whispered through the fabric. It had been sewn in secret, worn in silence, and now it was pulling the thread of a mystery that someone had worked tirelessly to erase. Miss Marple's mind shifted gears. She folded her hands neatly in her lap, considering the complexities of it all. Not every lie is spoken aloud, she reflected. Some are stitched into the very fabric of life, worn with care, carried quietly until the moment someone decides it must all be undone. Curiosity, when tempered with discipline, often uncovers the most satisfying of truths. Miss Marple's next move was quiet, but deliberate. She asked to have the veil examined closely, under the pretense of mending a small tear, a request that Miss Cynthia, the seamstress, readily accepted. But Miss Marple was not interested in simple repairs. She sought something far more elusive, something the seamstress herself had not even noticed. As she carefully ran her fingers along the edge, Miss Marple felt something unusual, barely perceptible to the untrained eye. There was a faint pattern of stitches hidden in the inner hem of the veil. Unlike the delicate decorative stitches, these were short, uneven, oddly spaced. To the untrained observer, they would have seemed like imperfections, but to Miss Marple, they spoke a language she knew well. She had spent many long hours deciphering such patterns during the war, knitting samplers by candlelight in the blackout. These were no ordinary stitches. They were Morse code. As her crochet hook traced each line, Miss Marple murmured the translation in her mind. The name spelled out was clear: Agnes. It was not a set of initials. It was a name full, clear, and undeniably embedded within the very thread of the fabric. The significance hit Miss Marple with quiet force. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to honor Agnes, perhaps to protect her. But someone else, years before, had gone to equal lengths to erase her from memory, to bury her so deeply that she might never resurface. Yet, as Miss Marple knew well, embroidery, like memory, has a way of outlasting even silence. And now, through the veil, Agnes was speaking again. The thought echoed in her mind as she laid the veil across her lap and stared into the empty hearth, the weight of the discovery sinking in. The veil was not just a relic of the past. It was a testament, a clue, and a silent cry for the truth that had been buried with Agnes's name. It was during a quiet, mid-morning visit to the vicar's parlor that Miss Marple found the moment she had been waiting for. The pieces were falling into place. The veil, the name, the secrecy. It was all converging, and Miss Marple knew, with her usual quiet certainty, that the final pieces of the puzzle were closer than ever. But what she could not yet see was how deep this mystery truly ran, and how far-reaching the consequences would be for those who had tried so desperately to keep Agnes's story buried. The vicar's parlor, modest yet meticulously tidy, provided a perfect setting for the quiet truths that preferred a soft-spoken entrance. The atmosphere was calm, almost serene, as the vicar poured the tea with hands that, though steady, bore the quiet weight of recent events. Miss Marple stirred hers slowly, taking a moment before speaking. Her voice, gentle as always, carried a weight of reflection rather than direct inquiry. She casually mentioned Edwin's nature, describing him as gentle, thoughtful, and reserved, traits that had been undeniable in the quiet man. Then, without urgency, she spoke of the locket, the veil, the photograph, and the inscription. But her tone was not accusatory. It was the tone of someone piecing together a sorrowful mosaic, the pieces of a story that had been hidden for far too long. She had no need to ask. She believed the vicar already understood. When she gently brought up Sister Agnes, Miss Marple's careful choice of words caught the vicar's attention. The vicar's spoon paused mid-air for just a moment, a subtle tremor of recognition flashing across his face, before he continued, his movements now slower, more deliberate. It was not until later, when the tea was growing cold and the room had settled into the quiet rhythm of conversation, that Miss Marple spoke of Claire Mallory. She mentioned her with measured caution, noting that Claire wore Agnes's memory, like a garment, an ever-present reminder of a love lost, yet never fully forgotten. She added softly, "But Edwin never loved her. There was no outrage in the vicar's response, only a long drawn-out silence, a silence that stretched unbroken, until his head gave a slow, reluctant nod. Yes, Edwin had loved Agnes. The kind of love that quiet men often carry, a love they never speak of aloud, but one that weighs heavily on their hearts nonetheless. It had not been a fleeting affection, nor a brief infatuation. It had been real, but it had been inconvenient, both for Edwin and Agnes. The village, with its expectations and narrow views, had watched with disapproval. The church, with its rigid rules, had looked on in judgment. Agnes had broken one unspoken rule. Edwin had broken another. And someone very careful, very precise, had made sure they both paid the price for it. The vicar's words, when they came, were spoken with a reluctance born of a man trained in forgiveness, but haunted by memories. He admitted, with quiet regret, what Miss Marple had already suspected. Edwin had planned to leave, but not for the shame that gossip had suggested. No, Edwin's reasons were far more personal, more profound. He had planned to leave to be free. He had secured employment abroad, intending to take Agnes with him. Quietly, without the church's blessing, without fanfare, or the village's approval, they would have left, together. Agnes, contrary to the gossip that had followed her death, had not been pregnant. She had not stolen funds or committed any crime. She had simply made a choice to follow love rather than obedience. That choice, in the confines of the convent, with its strict rules, and in the judgmental eyes of the village, had cost her everything. But before their plan could come to fruition, before they could escape together, a letter had reached the Mother Superior. An anonymous note had been delivered, tipped off by someone who feared the repercussions of their love, and sought to ensure that the plan would never succeed. The details surrounding Agnes's confinement were carefully managed, just enough to raise the specter of impropriety, without ever fully revealing the truth. She was confined to her quarters under the weight of a scandalous, unspoken accusation. Edwin, the man she had loved, was swiftly summoned to London the very next morning, only to be killed in the raid that followed. That same night, Agnes vanished. No one could say for certain whether she fled in grief, disgrace, or worse, but her absence became as much of a mystery as her sudden tragic disappearance. Miss Marple let the silence settle in the room, unafraid of its weight. It was a silence that carried the burden of years, and with it, the echoes of betrayal. She had long known that betrayal often wore the face of righteousness, of a well-intentioned soul convinced they were doing what was best. And in this quiet, tidy vicarage, someone had carefully pulled the thread that unraveled 2 lives, and possibly a third. It was never malice, Miss Marple reflected. The most deeply wounded were often victims of love, twisted by fear, care disfigured by control. The betrayal of Edwin and Agnes had not come from an enemy, nor from someone seeking revenge. No, it had come from someone who believed they were protecting something, a name, a faith, a future. The consequences, however, had been disastrous. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the letter that had reached the convent. It could not have come from a stranger. The knowledge it contained, Edwin's plans, the veil, the secretive meetings, required a familiarity that only someone close to the situation could have possessed. The letter was written not in the belief of harming, but in the misguided hope of saving. It was written by someone who had believed that by removing Agnes, they would avert scandal, preserve honor, and protect the future they had carefully planned. Instead, it had set into motion a chain of events that resulted in the loss of both. The most dangerous betrayals, Miss Marple mused, are those committed in the name of order and protection. And now, with Claire Mallory's death, the original silence, the one that had been forced upon Agnes, had returned. The one who had once interfered to prevent scandal was now doing so again, but this time to prevent the scandal from resurfacing. They had buried one secret with Agnes, but that secret had refused to stay buried. In every village, there exists someone who knows more than they say, and says less than they know. In Nether Hatchington, that role belonged unequivocally to Mrs. Littimore, the vicarage housekeeper. For over 30 years, she had been loyal not only to the Aldridge family, but also to a set of unspoken rules that governed her own secrets. It was clear to Miss Marple that Mrs. Littimore had seen far more than she had let on. Her quiet demeanor and impeccable service had always concealed a sharp mind, one that had witnessed the slow unraveling of the village's most guarded truths. Now, as the current mystery deepened, Miss Marple knew that Mrs. Littimore held the key. The question remained, would she reveal what she knew, or would she protect the past that had been buried so carefully, so deeply, all these years? Miss Marple had long been observant of Mrs. Littimore's behavior, subtle yet telling signs that spoke volumes. The tightening of her lips whenever Agnes's name came up, the swift rustling of linen when Edwin's belongings were mentioned. Mrs. Littimore had been an integral part of the Aldridge household during the war, remaining steadfast in her post, never once leaving. She had served tea to Agnes, pressed Edwin's collars, and kept a watchful eye over both, all the while silently tending to her own unspoken emotions. But Miss Marple did not accuse. Instead, she reflected on the quiet suffering that must have been wrought by loving someone from the periphery, from the margins, never allowed to step into the light. To watch as their affections shifted away, as Edwin's gaze fell not upon a suitable parish girl, but upon Agnes, a novice whose presence had stirred unease in those who held sway over the village's expectations. It was a silent, unbearable heartbreak, Miss Marple mused, to witness such a thing. Littimore's actions had not been born of hatred. No, they were driven by wounded devotion that had been allowed to fester for years without healing. And like any wound left untended, it deepened over time. The silence, the years of watching and waiting, had eventually driven her to take action, not out of malice, but out of a desperate need to preserve what she believed was rightfully hers. Wounds, when neglected, do not simply heal, they fester, and left unchecked, they can kill. The final piece of confirmation arrived, not through a direct confrontation, but through discovery. On a quiet walk through the vicarage storage room, Miss Marple noticed something out of place, a small wooden box hidden beneath a stack of unused hymnals. Inside she found more than just forgotten church supplies. There, tucked away and carefully wrapped in faded tissue, was a brass plaque, unpolished but unmistakable. Its engraving was clear, though the years had dulled its luster: Sister Agnes, 1940. The screw holes on the plaque told their own story. This had once been affixed to the commemorative board at St. Winfrid's, the very board now conspicuously absent of any mention of Agnes. Her name had been erased, scrubbed from the records without ceremony, without a public declaration of disgrace. Miss Marple stared at the plaque, her mind piecing together the significance of the quiet removal. This was no official act, no church mandate. It had been a covert operation, carried out by someone with access, discretion, and a clear motive. The silent erasure of Agnes's memory had been done to rewrite history, to erase the scandal before it could take root. There had been no formal declaration of Agnes's disgrace, no public condemnation, just a subtle private revision. Littimore, who had been responsible for maintaining the convent's linens after the nuns were dispersed, had also maintained something far more sinister, the secret of Agnes's erasure from history. The housekeeper had kept the truth buried, knowing full well the power of silence. But now, that silence had begun to speak, and Miss Marple could feel the weight of it, the weight of a long-hidden betrayal that could no longer be contained. As the hidden truths began to surface, the threads of the past weaved their way through the present, and it was clear now that the silent lie had become a dangerous thing to preserve. The narrative of Agnes had been carefully crafted, and when that narrative was threatened by a woman who returned to the vicarage wearing Agnes's veil, Mrs. Littimore's resolve had been tested once more. But this time, she acted not to destroy the truth, but to preserve the lie, one that had long been stitched into the fabric of the village's history. The veil had been a symbol of Agnes's absence, a marker of her removal, and the lie that had surrounded her disappearance was too fragile to survive the confrontation that was now inevitable. Miss Marple, knowing the weight of the secrets that still lingered in the air, requested that all those involved gather in the vicarage library. It was not for the sake of spectacle, but for the sake of truth, truth that had been buried beneath years of silence. The room was charged with an air of tension as Vicar Aldrich sat, pale and motionless, his face a mask of restrained anxiety. Mrs. Littimore, ever the diligent housekeeper, stood beside the tea trolley, her hands folded tightly, a sign of her unease. Inspector Cray, though outwardly skeptical, had agreed to attend, albeit reluctantly. The scene was set, not for a dramatic revelation, but for an understanding that had been long overdue. Miss Marple's voice, calm and steady, began the delicate unraveling. She spoke not with accusation, but with a gentle remembrance of Edwin, of Agnes, and of the veil that had once been stitched with love, but buried beneath layers of silence and guilt. Her words were measured, tracing the path of the mystery backward. The missing ledger pages, the embroidered veil, the locket hidden within Edwin's psalter, and the plaque that had been removed in secrecy. She didn't need to raise her voice to stir the room. Every word she spoke seemed to carry a weight that grew heavier with each passing second. Turning to Mrs. Littimore, Miss Marple posed a quiet but penetrating question. Was it out of loyalty or guilt that she had acted all those years ago? Mrs. Littimore did not answer immediately. Instead, she stood there, her eyes brimming with something far deeper than defiance, regret. The truth was in her eyes, the silent admission that she had only meant to protect a fractured love, a love that had already been broken. In her attempt to preserve the lie, she had in fact shattered something far more fragile, the fragile thread that bound the vicarage, the Aldrich family, and the village's quiet facade. And now that thread could never be repaired. The atmosphere in the vicarage library was thick with silence, heavier than any accusation. The curtains, drawn tight against the growing dusk, added to the oppressive mood, and the faint crackling of the fire in the hearth was the only sound breaking the stillness. The room was a study in contrasts. The aged stone walls seemed to echo with the weight of the past, while the people in the room sat frozen, caught between the present and the haunting specters of long-buried truths. Miss Marple stood in the center, not as an accuser, but as a bearer of truth. She was the interpreter of forgotten stories, a quiet witness to the tangled emotions and unspoken burdens that had brought them all here. Her voice, though soft, carried the undeniable weight of finality. She began with the name most had tried to forget, Sister Agnes. She traced the thread backward, slowly, methodically, from the locket hidden within Edwin's psalter to the embroidered veil that had been carefully preserved. She mentioned the plaque, once proudly displayed, now erased in secrecy, and the letter addressed to a man long dead, a letter that had set the course for everything that had come afterward. Each revelation was like a delicate stitch being pulled, unraveling the tightly woven tapestry of secrets that had kept the village in its quiet grip for so long. Miss Marple's calm demeanor masked the enormity of what was being revealed. This was no simple case of forgotten memories. It was the slow and steady dismantling of a carefully constructed lie, and the truth was now too powerful to ignore. Miss Marple's words, soft but heavy with meaning, filled the vicarage library, pulling the thread of truth from the tangled web of lies that had been woven for so many years. She explained that the story of Claire Mallory was not one of deception or impersonation, as many had feared. Claire was not a nun, nor was she a fraud in the malicious sense that the village had believed. She had not come to Blackthorn to deceive or blackmail anyone. She had come to restore a memory long buried, to speak for the woman whose voice had been erased by the weight of silence, and whose love had been deemed unworthy by the eyes of others. Mrs. Littimore, standing rigidly beside the fire, did not speak, but the way her shoulders shifted betrayed something deeper than indignation. It was the unmistakable weight of grief. The truth had touched something in her that she had tried so hard to bury. As Miss Marple's gaze moved toward the question that had plagued them all, why had Claire Mallory returned in such a guise? Why had she chosen to wear the habit and adopt such deception if her motives were pure? The answer was not one of cunning or subterfuge, Miss Marple explained, but of reverence. Claire had not returned to impersonate Agnes. She had returned to defend her, to walk the same steps, kneel at the same altar, and reclaim, stitch by stitch, the love that had been so deliberately torn apart. In the final days of Agnes's life, Claire had uncovered a truth so painful, it could not be ignored. Agnes had not fled from guilt, as many believed. She had died in an air raid, her life snuffed out amidst the rubble of Paris, buried beneath the wreckage of a building with no names or prayers to mark her passing. Claire had been with her in those last moments, holding her hand as the world crumbled around them, and in the deafening silence of the sirens, she had promised Agnes, her closest friend, that she would carry her home. The veil, with its Morse code message stitched into the fabric, had never been worn in mockery. It had been a desperate plea for attention, for acknowledgement, for belief. It was not a disguise, but a symbol of devotion, not to God, perhaps, but to a solemn promise made in the shadow of war. Claire had become justice, not seeking it, but embodying it, carrying it with her like an unspoken oath. And that was why her return had become unbearable to those who had long since buried Agnes's memory. To them, Claire's very existence threatened the carefully constructed peace they had clung to for so long. The war had buried many things beneath the rubble, secrets, hopes, and lives. Miss Marple, with her long years of experience, knew that the wounds caused by bombs were not always visible. The promises made in the chaos of crowded hospitals, and in the darkness of underground cellars, were just as sacred, if not more so, than those sworn before any altar. Claire and Agnes had met in Paris, both young, both displaced in their own ways. Agnes had left the convent unofficially, without scandal, seeking a life that was less confined, though she had not abandoned her principles. In Claire, she had found not just a friend, but a refuge. Claire, in turn, had found in Agnes the kind of strength that was quiet yet unyielding, a woman unafraid to love, to question, and to risk everything for what she believed was right. When the news of Edwin's death reached them, it was a turning point. But it was not just a tragedy, it was the catalyst that had forced them both to confront the fragile and often painful truths they had tried to bury. Together, they had stood on the precipice of a world in turmoil, bound by a bond stronger than blood, and united by a secret that could never be allowed to fade into the shadows again. Agnes's breaking was not the dramatic collapse of someone on the verge of madness, but the quiet, inevitable unraveling of a woman whose last connection to the world had finally been severed. She had once again taken up the veil, not as a devotion to God, but as a surrender to grief, a gesture to hide from the world she could no longer face. The veil, once a symbol of faith, had become an emblem of sorrow, and in the silent ruins of Paris, she had breathed her last beneath the crushing weight of the city's devastation. She never had the chance to return to England as she had promised. No second chance to reclaim her life or her love. In that haunting moment, Claire had gathered what remained. An old locket, the veil, the fragile promise made long ago, and carried them not just across miles, but through years, through an ocean of silence and judgment. A promise forged in the heart of war had survived not only its own collapse, but the condemnation of those who could never understand the weight of Agnes's death. Miss Marple's voice broke the heavy silence, speaking softly but firmly, as though the words themselves carried the burden of history. Agnes did not die because of her past, she said, her words like a pebble, dropped into a still pond, sending ripples across the room. Her death was the result of someone else's inability to bear the return of a past that was never meant to be erased. It was a truth that had remained buried for so long, and now in this quiet English parish, it could not help but surface. Claire had not come to bring justice. She had come to bring resolution, a resolution that had been denied for far too long. The war had taken so much, lives, homes, futures. But it was the unspoken promises, the things left unsaid that had left the deepest scars. And now, even as the years had passed, the truth could no longer be held in the shadows. Turning her gaze towards Mrs. Litmore, Miss Marple's expression softened, not with sympathy, but with understanding. There was no accusation in her voice, no demand for confession. Instead, she spoke with the calm authority of someone who had seen the world unfold in all its ugliness and grace. "You did what you believed was right," Miss Marple said, her words cutting through the thick air like a blade. "Years ago you thought you were protecting Edwin, shielding him from a love that you felt was improper. You saw his devotion to Agnes, and feared it, feared the consequences it might bring. So in your mind, you acted out of mercy. You sent the letter to the convent not out of malice, but in the belief that you were doing what was necessary." Mrs. Litmore's breath caught, her posture stiffening, as though the weight of that long-ago decision had suddenly been placed upon her once more. "But," Miss Marple continued, "when it all fell apart, when Edwin died, and Agnes disappeared, you were left with guilt that time could not soften. Instead, time twisted it, contorted it into something darker, something you could not escape." The room seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple's words landed, one after another, like stones sinking into a murky lake. When Claire Mallory arrived, wearing the same veil, carrying the same locket, you didn't see a woman seeking redemption. You saw a ghost who had returned to demand what had been lost, what had been stolen. Claire had not come to accuse. She had come to make right what had been wronged. But for Mrs. Litmore, there was no forgiveness left. Her instincts, those honed by years of protecting propriety, had kicked in. She had not recognized Claire as a soul seeking peace. No, to her, Claire was a reminder of the past, a past she had buried so deeply that it felt like a grave beneath her feet. Ghosts once awakened were not easily dismissed. They demanded acknowledgement, and with them came the weight of atonement. Miss Marple let the words settle in the room, allowing them to absorb into the very fabric of the atmosphere. There was no accusation in her tone, no triumph, only a quiet understanding, as if the truth had finally been given its due, and now it was time for release. Claire had not come to judge, she had come to bring the truth back to life. But Mrs. Litmore, unable to face what she had done, had already judged herself. In her panic, she had retreated into silence, the only refuge she had ever known. It was a silence that had once been a shield, but now, it was the very thing that kept her trapped in the past, in the ever-present guilt that had consumed her from the moment she made that fateful choice. The final moments, like so many pieces of a puzzle, were not extracted from Mrs. Litmore's confession. Instead, they were meticulously pieced together from the logic that Miss Marple had followed, an unbroken thread leading to an inevitable conclusion. Claire had entered the church that afternoon, alone, with a quiet determination. She didn't seek confession, she sought solace, perhaps even closure. The confessional was a sacred space, but not for absolution. There, among the ancient stone walls, she had come not to cleanse herself of sin, but to leave behind a small piece of the past. The locket, the veil, fragments of Agnes's name, hidden carefully within their folds. She carried the weight of a history no one else would ever truly understand. But Mrs. Litmore had been waiting too. Miss Marple could not say whether the woman had intended a confrontation, or simply wished to observe. But the careful preparations were clear. The undusted hinge, the removal of ledger pages, the missing plaque, all whispered of a woman anticipating the return of the past, a past she would rather silence before it could speak too loudly. The signs were unmistakable. Mrs. Litmore had been preparing for this moment, to prevent the truth from surfacing. When the confrontation came, it was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Claire had not fought back. She had recognized the woman before her, perhaps even understood the silent dread in her eyes. Miss Marple suspected that Claire might have reached out, said something kind. Her nature, after all, was not one of vengeance. But in that moment, Mrs. Litmore wasn't listening to Claire. She was hearing the voices of the past, the echoing guilt of her own conscience, and the relentless chorus of what-ifs that had plagued her for decades. The weight of her years of silent servitude, of carrying a burden that no one had asked her to bear, had become unbearable, and in the midst of that panic, that human fragility, she had acted without thought. The veil, once a symbol of devotion, of love, became a noose, its threads tightening, choking the very life from Claire. Miss Marple, her voice calm as always, allowed the final piece to fall into place. She did not speak of retribution. There was no satisfaction to be found in that. Instead, she unfolded the veil one last time, tracing the delicate, embroidered letters with careful fingers, letters that told a story of love, loss and unspoken promises. She held up the locket, its photo of a young Claire, unguarded, innocent, and the inscription within, Pour toujours mon amour, her voice barely a whisper as she laid them gently upon the table between them. There, in that moment, Miss Marple knew that truth, when it is real, does not need to be shouted to be heard. It simply needs to be laid before those who are willing to see it. The room, heavy with sorrow, fell into a profound silence. It was not shock that held them. It was mourning, the shared grief of lives altered, of choices made long ago that could never be undone. The vicar bowed his head, his prayer unsaid, but understood, while Miss Cynthia dabbed at her eyes, unable to contain the deep sorrow she had witnessed. Even Inspector Cray, usually so brisk and businesslike, offered no objection to what had transpired. It was clear to him, as it was to everyone present, that the truth had found its place, not in the loud aggressive declarations of guilt, but in the quiet recognition of something far more powerful. The past, with all its mistakes, had found its voice in the most unexpected of ways, and in that silence, the weight of the years seemed to dissipate, leaving behind only the raw truth of what had been lost, and what in the end, could never truly be reclaimed. Mrs. Litmore stood there, her presence heavy with the weight of a truth long buried. She did not weep, but her shoulders trembled slightly, betraying the control she had fought so hard to maintain. Her eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, held nothing of defense. There was no argument left in them, only the weariness of a heart that had carried a burden far too long. In those quiet moments, it was clear that no words could undo the past. No official charges, no trial, no legal verdict would ever capture the full gravity of what had truly transpired. But perhaps, as Miss Marple quietly observed, that was not the point. In the end, there would be no court to judge, no public outcry to echo across the pages of the papers. The village, however, would know, and maybe, just maybe, that knowledge was enough. It was enough for Sister Agnes, whose name had been restored, for Claire, whose promise was kept, and for Nether Hatchington, whose secrets had long been hidden in the shadows. This was not a scandal that would stain the pages of history. It was a reckoning, a gentle one, but profound nonetheless. In the days that followed, the village of Nether Hatchington settled back into its familiar rhythm, though something had shifted in the air. The silence, once thick with secrets, now felt softer, more reflective. The shops reopened, and the usual chatter filled the streets once again. The postman resumed his cheerful whistling on his morning rounds. The bells of St. Winter's Church rang once more, not in alarm, but in quiet remembrance. No grand statement was issued, no article published in the papers. There was no scandal to document, no headlines to shout the truth from the rooftops. But for those who mattered, the ones whose hearts truly understood, there was a subtle shift. They walked more carefully now, their steps a little gentler, as though the weight of the past had become a shared understanding between them. The caretaker's cottage, once the epicenter of so much turmoil, stood still. Its shutters remained closed, but at the threshold, a wreath of winter jasmine had been quietly placed. There were no names, no claims, and no one dared to disturb it. It was as though the flowers themselves were a silent tribute, laid there by hands unseen. Mrs. Litmore continued in her post, but there was a change in her. She was still the same woman, yet somehow smaller, quieter in her movements. She seemed to have withdrawn into herself, her gaze often drifting toward the chapel window at dusk, as though seeking something beyond the familiar. The vicar, in his Sunday sermon, spoke not of judgment, but of mercy, the kind that comes when truth, long buried, is finally spoken, even if it is spoken too late. It was not an easy truth, but it was one that healed in ways no other word could. Miss Marple returned to her needlework, and her afternoon teas, ever the picture of tranquility. She did not speak much of what had transpired, but those who knew her well could see it in her eyes, the quiet understanding that lingered behind them. It wasn't the satisfaction of having solved a mystery, but the quiet realization that some truths, once revealed, change everything. They shift the course of lives, even if only in small unspoken ways. The brass plaque, so long absent, was returned to its rightful place. One morning, it simply appeared, polished and secure, gleaming faintly beneath the light filtering through the stained glass windows of the chapel. The inscription remained unchanged. In devotion and service, Sister Agnes, 1940. There were no questions. There was no fanfare, no ceremony. It simply was, a silent witness to the truth that had unfolded in the hearts of those who had lived with it, and now, perhaps, could finally rest. As the congregation passed, a brief but noticeable pause rippled through them. Some tilted their heads in curiosity. Others brushed their gloved fingers over the plaque, almost as though to verify its existence. An unspoken question lingering in the air. Was it always there? Miss Hartnell, ever the observer, remarked with a certain detachment. Had it not always been here? Perhaps it simply fell and was forgotten. Mrs. Weatherby, however, said nothing. For once her gaze lingered, her eyes fixed on the brass plaque longer than usual. Though her face betrayed no emotion, it was as though a small part of her was wrestling with the memory. Something half remembered, now made real again. Miss Marple, on her next visit, stopped before it, deliberately slowing her pace. She didn't scrutinize it. There was no need for that. With a quiet nod, almost as if greeting an old acquaintance, she acknowledged its presence. It was as though Agnes, who had once been erased, silenced, had now been quietly restored, without fanfare. There was no need for questions, no need to ask who had removed it, or who had placed it back. It didn't matter. In the simple act of returning the plaque, a weight was lifted from the very stones of the chapel, a silence broken in the air, that had long held the village captive. And in that small, yet profound restoration, the village allowed itself to remember, not the errors of the past, but the one who had been wronged. Claire Mallory, whose name had been buried in shadow, was not laid to rest in some obscure, forgotten grave. She had not met her end in disgrace, nor had she been cast aside to a lonely corner of the world. Instead, her resting place was modest, beneath the spreading branches of an old sycamore tree on the eastern edge of the village. Here the wild flower bloomed freely, and the soil, untouched by judgment, welcomed her with open arms. The vicar, speaking not of falsehoods or deceptions, instead offered a quiet sermon about devotion, about promises kept despite years of silence, about perseverance in the face of misunderstanding. A handful of villagers, some of whom had long kept their distance from the shadows of the past, arrived not out of obligation, but perhaps out of a deeper understanding, one born of time or perhaps penitence. Miss Cynthia, ever the one to hold back her emotions, carefully placed a single white lily upon the earth. Miss Peabody, in a rare break from her rigid formality, removed her gloves, and with a solemnity that spoke volumes, she placed a small folded swatch of muslin, delicately edged in lace, atop the casket. Each gesture, each offering, spoke more than mere words ever could. Miss Marple, though she did not linger, walked alone to the site the following morning. She left nothing but a single violet, its petals vibrant yet soft, an acknowledgement, not of gesture, but of presence. It was never about what was given, but the quiet, steady acknowledgement that Claire had lived a life others had misunderstood, a life that had spoken the truth in ways no one else could. And now, she rested not beneath a veil, not hidden from the world, but in a place where no protection was needed. Here her story was free to be told, unencumbered by the past, her truth now unshackled. The seasons changed slowly that year. Spring lingered a bit longer than usual, almost as though it too had been hesitant to approach, unsure of the stillness that had settled over the village. But when it finally arrived, it came with a quiet force. Miss Marple's garden, always a reflection of her careful attention, blossomed with a serenity that seemed almost deliberate. The roses, trimmed with love and precision, began to unfurl their petals in the usual order. First pale blush, then ivory, and finally the deep crimson, a shade so vivid that it always reminded her of the most difficult truths. As she carefully pruned away a wayward stem, her thoughts, as they often did in moments of solitude, drifted to the nature of guilt. She considered how it seemed to settle into the hidden corners of lives, how it curled itself around decisions made in fear, decisions that were never meant to cause harm. Guilt, she mused, clung more tightly than hatred, and its shadow stretched longer than any malice could cast. Agnes, silenced not by cruelty, but by the grip of her own fears. Claire, returning not for vengeance, but for redemption. And Mrs. Litmore, what had driven her to seek a path that had ultimately led to the preservation of a memory she believed lost forever? The weight of those secrets could have destroyed them all. Yet in the end, they had only weighed down the truth, held captive for too long by the very silence that had protected them. Miss Marple reflected, as she often did, on the way truth came to light, not in grand declarations, but often in the softest of ways, in a veil folded with care, hidden in a stitch no one saw, or buried with a locket, its meaning more potent than the years it had been concealed. She bent to pick up a petal that had fallen to the ground, her fingers lingering over it for a moment, before she whispered almost absently, "It is curious how the human heart so often tries to mend its mistakes with silence, when what it truly needs is a little truth, and a little kindness." The truth, when it finally revealed itself, was not fierce or loud. It entered the light with a quiet grace, something Miss Marple had learned to recognize long ago. It wasn't wrapped in fury, but in the understanding that comes only when time has peeled back the layers of sorrow and regret. Guilt, she thought, twisted by years of silence, had been the true villain in this tale, not hatred, not malice. Claire Mallory, though, had never come to deceive the village. She had come to honor a friend, to fulfill a promise made beneath the weight of falling rubble, a promise that had taken years to keep, but that was never forgotten. And Miss Marple, in her quiet way, had always known. She had always listened to the things that others had long since turned their ears away from. Justice, she realized, didn't always wear a uniform. It didn't always carry a gavel. Sometimes it wore a veil, stitched in Morse code, a silent acknowledgement of a name, returned to its rightful place, a simple, delicate act, one that spoke louder than any courtroom drama ever could. The plaque was restored, and in its presence the village could finally breathe, could remember, not what had gone wrong, but who had been wronged. And as Miss Marple stepped back, a single question lingered in the air, unspoken, but heavy with meaning. What would you have done? Would you have sought justice? Or would you have kept the silence, trying to protect the fragile threads of memory, knowing full well that only truth could truly set them free? If you were in Mrs. Litmore's shoes, what would you have done? Would you have kept the secret close, hiding it away out of love and a sense of duty? Or would you have gathered the strength to speak the truth, no matter the cost, no matter the pain it might cause? And what of Claire? Was her deception truly wrong? Or was it, in the end, the only way the past could ever be heard, the only path to redemption for the mistakes that had once haunted them all? These are the questions that linger, long after the final chapter has been written. We want to know your thoughts, your theories, your favorite moments, and your personal reflections. The answers you share, the perspectives you offer, help build a community of listeners who come together in the shared love of mystery and suspense, unraveling the layers of stories that challenge both the mind and the heart. Your voice, your insight, is invaluable. It adds to the warmth and richness of this storytelling space, where every mystery is more than just a puzzle. It's a doorway into a deeper understanding of ourselves and the choices we make. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe, so you never miss another Miss Marple-style mystery, where every clue hides a deeper meaning, every twist of fate is tied to history, And every resolution carries the weight of unspoken truths. And if you think someone you know would love a good whodunit wrapped in mystery, tea roses, and the shadows of regret, share this episode with them. Let them discover the world of twists and turns that lies just beneath the surface of every small village, where secrets are buried in plain sight, waiting for the keenest eyes to uncover them. Thank you for being part of this story. Your presence, your attention, makes all the difference. We'll see you in the next mystery, where another puzzle waits to be solved, another truth to be uncovered, and another heart to be set free.